Well, humans, we were talking earlier about iconography. Humans seem obsessed with making icons. They love making icons. And in fact, in the old scriptural tradition, part of the problem is that, you know, Moses pops up to the mountain and comes back down, and then they've made a new icon. It's like they can't stop making icons all the time. That doesn't go away just because we don't believe in God anymore. Society is secularizing and all that. What do you think are the icons of the secular age?
Yeah. Well, so there's a way, I think especially in Christian theology, like what we'll do is we will separate the difference between icon and idol. And the difference between an icon and idol is that the icon affords the transcendent. That is, it is pointed to. It is not something which stops at itself, but rather leads up towards higher participation. So it's like if I encounter an image of Saint John the Baptist, well, the image of Saint John the Baptist only exists in my life because he pointed to Christ, and that image of Christ only exists in my life because he pointed to the infinite, invisible, transcendent. And so that is the way that icons function. They're a kind of ladder of participation. The idea about idols is that in some ways they are factitious. They try to capture it all in themselves, right? They try to kind of capture your attention and keep it within its sphere. The idol doesn't offer itself up to a higher participation. And so I would say that in our world now, we are surrounded with idols constantly. That is, we are constantly asked to give our attention to things in ways which are purely subservient to the thing itself, right? Advertising itself has a form of idolatry to it, because the sometimes advertising can be pointing to a higher good, but most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's just like, buy this thing, it will accomplish all your desires. I will give you what you want if you get this thing. And so there's a sense in which if I can just get that, then I will get what I want. And that's the way in which, idols are represented in the Old Testament. If you look at that story of the calf, the golden calf, for example, right? It's like Moses goes up to get the revelation. People down here were like, well, we need something here. We need something to kind of gather us together. They make this golden calf, and then they have an orgy, basically. It's like the idol affords you your desires. And so that's why it's related to, that's why it can be related to anything that you give your attention to too much, whether it's, porn, whether it's alcohol, with all the classical things that can capture you and can become your God for all intents and purposes.
But I mean, would it be right to say that pornography or alcohol are idols? And the thing that people do with idols is that they worship them. And I suppose another thing that I'm a bit unclear on is what it means to worship something.
Yeah.
I mean, can I worship this microphone? Can I worship?
You could.
Drink,
it'd be a little, yeah, it would be a little ridiculous. So that is, the worship is, the best way to understand worship is, you could say that it is the highest point of your attention, right? It is the point of attention in which there is no higher. It doesn't fit into a higher good. So a good example, like this is not woo woo. Like I want to be careful people to think like, oh, here, what's Jonathan talking about, right? So it's like you're making food and you're cutting the onions, right? You give attention to that, but that attention is bound in the recipe that you're making. And the making of that recipe is bound in the fact that you're going to sit together as a family and eat. And that sitting together as a family and eat is bound into the love of the family itself as something which provides, and then you can keep scaling that up all the way up to the highest good, which is the infinite transcendent. And so there are some things in the world that are more in danger of capturing our attention fully. And, and it's just by the nature of who we are. And so obviously a microphone, it would be difficult for you to worship a microphone. It'd be harder, but alcohol is the good. It's fine, but it can become a god. And we know people for who it does become a god, and it does kind of take over their lives. And it's the same with, I wouldn't say pornography, but I would say sex. Let's say sexuality is obviously something good, but it has to be ordered in a certain way for it to not become something that traps you and kind of takes over your attention, so that you can't think of other things, and you can't let's say, put your attention into higher, and everybody knows it, like, especially if you remember when you were, I mean, I'm older now, but when I was 19 or whatever, right? It was really difficult to think. I mean, you think about sex all the time. It would take over your field of experience. You would see the world through the lens of sex, right? You would notice things, and the world would kind of organize itself in that way. And that can be dangerous, because that's not actually how the world works. The world isn't only made of sex. It's made of all kinds of other things that have to fit together towards higher goods.
I mean, there's of course a sense in which it makes sense as an atheist, thinking about evolutionary biology, why people just become obsessed with sex in this way. I mean, it is the mechanism by which things are created. It seems less natural to me, in other words, to suppress that in order to focus our attention on what the religious will say is really the creative power here. This is the real force that we should be focusing on. Why is it such a? In other words, if worship is supposed to be directed towards the transcendent and God, then why is it such an unnatural experience for so many people? Why is it so difficult?
Well, it'd be interesting to even take the way that you say sex. I think that even using evolutionary structures, being obsessed with the act and the pleasure of sex is actually counterproductive to the evolutionary goals, because the survival of the species is not bound up only in the orgasm. Like, there's a whole buffer around that, which has to do with the rearing of children, especially in terms of how humans deal with children. There's a whole structure around that, which has to do with the rearing of children and the familial relationships, which will assure the continuation of your line, however you want to think of it. And so the buffer around sexuality is already a constraint on the pleasure of sexuality. One of the problems that we have now, you could say, is that technology in some ways affords something which was impossible in an ancient world, right? Affords unlimited access to insane amounts of stimulus, of sexual stimulus, that in some ways can overpower a person in a way that is not conducive to evolutionary questions. And the proof of that is that, let's say, pornography leads to decline in population to some extent. It leads to erection problems. It leads to all these difficulties that will not bring about the continuation. And so the religious is the highest point of understanding that the smallest good that I feel, whether it's the pleasure of eating, the pleasure of sex, these different pleasures have to be encased and have to be constrained into higher goods. And to some extent, for you to even have those, right? If you want sexuality to be pleasure and not just a master that kind of overwhelms you, it has to be bound into these higher goods. And the same with food. If you just eat food for pleasure, at some point you will no longer have pleasure eating food. If you only have sex for pleasure, at some point you will no longer have pleasure in sex. In order for the thing to be good, it has to be kind of embedded into these higher participation.
Yeah, if it no longer points towards something more, or is done with the sort of attention focus towards something else and something more, then I suppose, like you were saying a moment ago, it becomes an idol rather than an icon. It becomes an end rather than a window through which to look at what really is beautiful and true. Fascinating.